I sat down with firearms historian Logan Metesh to talk about the craziest Cold War nuclear weapon of all, Project Pluto. I would like to welcome back to the show Logan Metesh of the High Caliber History webpage and firearms historian. And the last time we talked, we were talking about some bonkers, gonzo, crazy nuclear technology in the Davy Crockett. And whenever I think about the Davy Crockett, I always also think about what I think is probably the most bonkers and gonzo nuclear device of the Cold War, which was known as Project Pluto.
Yeah, Project Pluto is a very innocuous name for, as you so aptly put it, a bonkers and gonzo concept that really was just, well, it was bonkers and gonzo.
Do you want to take a stab at it and just give us a brief overview of what I'm talking about?
Sure. So Project Pluto began in 1957, and it was a concept between the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission to develop a small nuclear reactor that you could use to power a cruise missile that could stay airborne for an indefinite period of time before launching its payload on the intended target. And then, as if that wasn't bonkers and gonzo enough, you could then have this nuclear-powered cruise missile circle populated areas at low altitudes to spread radiation on the population before the engine eventually died out and it crashed into some unknown location and caused a nuclear crater of sorts. So there were a lot of crazy levels to what they were trying to do with Project Pluto. The more you learn about it, the more you have more and more questions, really.
Let's break that down. So essentially it was a nuclear ramjet. So essentially a ramjet is, let's see, which one of them is one of the MiGs was a ramjet, wasn't it? I don't think did US have ramjets?
I don't know off the top of my head. That is a good question, but I'm sure one of the podcast listeners knows the answer and they can tell us that.
But essentially, you'll sometimes see pictures of older fighter jets that essentially don't have a pointed nose. They've just got a big scoop. They look like a hollow point bullet. And that cavity is essentially a giant air intake, and it goes in to the interior of the jet engine, where it is heated with the burning jet fuel, and then because of that, it accelerates as it goes out and it creates thrust. Well, you can burn jet fuel and that gets hot, but you know what also gets hot? An unshielded nuclear reactor.
Exactly. Which, that just sounds like a great idea. I mean, why constrain your nuclear reactor in concrete for safety's sake? Why not just let it fly open, essentially, and expose all of your motors and your controls and everything else that's going on in this area to unmitigated radiation and atomic power?
Yeah.
Sounds like a great idea, right?
Yeah. That leads to a tricky scenario of how does one launch a nuclear power cruise missile?
Very carefully. So the way that you launch one of these guys is that it uses conventional rocket boosters attached to this cruise missile that they affectionately called a SLAM, which was an acronym for Supersonic Low Altitude Missile. So you launch the SLAM with conventional rocket boosters, and then once it gets its way up to cruising altitude, you turn on the nuclear reactor, and that powers the ramjet. And so now you've got this nuclear cruise missile circling the ocean or wherever for an unspecified period of time before you decide that you want to call it into service and drop it down to a much lower elevation and then wreak havoc on the population below.
Yeah, that's one of those factors that is one of those when you suddenly realize, oh yeah, like I remember asking somebody who was a submariner, well, how long can, a Los Angeles class, stay under? And they're like, until it runs out of food. because it has the capability of generating its own oxygen from the water, and it's got a nuclear reactor, so the fuel's gonna be lasting essentially forever. And yeah, it's just gonna be down there. It's gonna desalinating water, and yeah, it's just under the water, and it's gonna stay there until it's time to go home. And that was the same thing with this thing, because it's a nuclear reactor. They don't need to be refueled very often. Actually, do you know off the top of your head? I don't even know. Probably they didn't even get that far in the specs to realize exactly how long this thing could be launched for.
No, as far as I know, they didn't ever figure it out. They just said that, eventually the vehicle will crash due to one of two things. One, it ran out of fuel, or two, something on it mechanically failed. Mm-hmm. But even in the failure and the exhaustion of the fuel, it would still be deemed as a success, because wherever it fell would create a local radiation hotspot, and you've rubbed some salt in the wound of your enemy there by crashing your nuclear device into their populated areas.
Yeah. But so the plan was essentially to launch it and have it fly at high altitude, massive circles over, like, say, the Pacific Ocean, where it would be virtually undetectable and far away from everything. And essentially it could just wait there indefinitely, or to certain degrees of indefinitely, until it was called to action.
Exactly.
And also, I may add, you mentioned the fact that if it crashes, it will be a nuclear hotspot. That was also another thing that I read about in some of the books, is that if they ever decided to, quote unquote, decommission it, really the only safe way to do that was to crash it into an ocean trench.
Yeah, I mean, that's a feature, not a flaw, right?
Exactly. Just bury that reactor right next to the Earth's mantle and let it burrow its way down into the asthenosphere.
Exactly. Sounds like the perfect solution to this problem.
Okay, so let's now we've been talking about the boring part now. Now comes the exciting part. What would happen if the Ruskies attacked us, in the 1960s or 70s, whenever this thing might have existed? And now it's time to scramble the Project Pluto.
Well, so that's the interesting thing, and of course the entirety of the Cold War is predicated on the concept of mutually assured destruction, right? And that's kind of why Project Pluto fizzles out almost as quickly as it began. They test the first nuclear ramjet engine in May of 1961, and they actually had it mounted to a railroad car, and they fired it up and only ran it for a few seconds. And then it took another 3 years until 1964 before they tested the second one. It ran for 5 minutes at full power, but that was really it. Like I said, almost as soon as it came in, it was on its way out because of changing technologies. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were, some of the biggest threats between us and the Ruskies during the Cold War, had really made Project Pluto obsolete right away. But the Pentagon is actually the one that ended up shutting the project down, because their words, not mine, were that it was too provocative, and they felt that the Soviets might want to develop a Project Pluto of their own. And the issue with that is that, okay, we've got ICBMs and they've got ICBMs. Well, we have other technology to combat an ICBM sent towards us. We don't have any kind of technology to combat a nuclear ramjet engine with a nuclear warhead coming towards us. So basically, we were like, yeah, let's not do this so that they don't do it to us.
Well, I think also wasn't the original plans, or some of the original plans? I mean, obviously this is something that was never actually made, so we're all talking on speculative drawings and things like that. But was it originally supposed to be kind of a MIRV, a multi-warhead device?
Yeah, in theory, you could load multiple projectiles, multiple bombs on there, and guide this thing towards any number of targets.
So essentially it was a cruise missile that was also essentially an unmanned bomber.
Yes.
And it would fly over and bomb the targets. And then you mentioned this in the beginning, but then after it expended all of its bombs, it would then just strafe populated areas, and its exhaust was pure nuclear fallout.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it had a wide ranging lethality, if you will.
Also, the exhaust would be hot enough to create forest fires as well, which was an added bonus, if you will.
Absolutely. Be like, oh, you survived the atomic blast? Well, here, chances are you're not going to survive this radioactive forest fire.
Mm-hmm. And if you shot it down, then you would just the crash site would be both a nuclear hotspot and likely the location of a small nuclear meltdown,
right,
as well.
So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't,
Exactly. I mean, it's one of those things when you think about military weapons as far as their intention of causing the greatest number of casualties to the enemy and his infrastructure, it's really an amazing little thing, the Project Pluto. But at the same time, when you think about it as a human and the fact that you're going in war against another country, and the level of scorched earth, quite literally, that this thing could cause was outstanding.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was both the amazing and terrifying thing of it. It was the good news is this will wreak devastation on the enemy and they have no way to stop it. Bad news is if they develop one, this will wreak havoc on us and we have no way to stop it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think even in our current technology, I don't think we have any way to stop it, with the exception of detecting it before it's deployed in the first place and sinking it in the ocean ourselves. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's you're right. I have no knowledge of any way to stop that. If we do have that technology, we've not been clued into it.
Yeah, yeah. So it really kind of amazing and interesting, but also I'm super glad it never happened, because the Cold War was kind of scary enough as is.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. And the Cold War becomes scarier and scarier the more you learn about what could have been, and that's these two that we've talked about, Davy Crockett and Project Pluto. You can only imagine just how bad things would have been. It's the technology that most people aren't aware of that would have been the most devastating to us.
Yeah, crazy. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show again, Logan. It was really great talking with you.
Thanks for having me. I always enjoy my time here with you.
And again, that's Logan Metesh of High Caliber History.